Chapter 1. A Cup of Suspicion. Jessica Fletcher had never planned to linger in St Mary Mead beyond the weekend, but the little Hampshire village had a talent for drawing visitors into its quiet web. It was late June, and the hedgerows burned with dog roses. Swifts skimmed low over the thatched roofs, and a scent of fresh-cut grass drifted down every lane. Cabot Cove felt half a world away. She had come on the gentle insistence of her old friend, Miss Jane Marple, who was recovering from a bout of influenza and, characteristically, worried more about being a tiresome hostess than about her own health. "It would do me good simply to see you at the breakfast table," the elderly lady had written, the precise looping hand as neat as lace, and so Jessica, pleased to combine her European book tour with a quiet country visit, arrived on a mellow Friday afternoon, suitcase bumping along the gravel drive of St Mead Cottage. Within the hour she found herself seated in the Vicarage garden across the lane, a cup of Mrs. Clement's excellent Darjeeling warming her palms. It was the annual fundraising tea for the parish roof. Bunting fluttered between apple trees, and every villager of note had produced a plate of something iced, pickled, or raised. Reverend Clement, red-faced under his straw boater, introduced Jessica to Colonel Bantry and his wife Dolly, then drifted off to judge the jam competition. Colonel Bantry leaned conspiratorially. "I say, Mrs. Fletcher, forgive me, but is it true you've solved a murder or three in your time?" Jessica smiled modestly. "Occasionally I've helped the police see things from a different angle." She tucked a stray auburn curl behind her ear, "but I'd scarcely boast of it at a garden party." Dolly Bantry's eyes danced. "Oh, we're all terribly proud of our amateur sleuths here. Miss Marple sets the standard, of course. One almost feels dull without a mystery on the go." The Colonel harumphed. "Let's hope we remain dull, my dear." A clatter of china interrupted them. At the trestle table, Mrs. Meredith, new to the village, Jessica recalled, stood speechless, a plate of scones smashed at her feet. Opposite her, Mr. Leonard Wainwright, the church organist, dabbed his sleeve with a napkin, brown tea spreading like a tide. "Your elbow, madam," he said stiffly. "It was quite unavoidable, I'm sure." Mrs. Meredith's cheeks flamed. I'm dreadfully sorry." She knelt to gather the shards, but her hands shook. Jessica crossed to assist, noting the tension that rippled through the watching guests. Miss Hartnell whispered behind her program. Young Tommy Clement nudged a friend and rolled his eyes. Jessica crouched beside the flustered woman. "Allow me." "No harm done, truly." She lifted a wedge of broken saucer, an inexpensive modern design, unlike the Vicarage's older set. Odd, she thought, the kind of detail her novelist's mind tucked away. A low voice cut through the murmurs. "Clumsy in the kitchen as well, are we?" Leonard Wainwright's remark was barely audible. Yet Jessica saw Mrs. Meredith flinch. Before she could respond, Miss Marple, walking stick in hand, appeared like a benign ghost. "Now, Leonard," she chided, "kindness costs nothing. Mrs. Meredith has offered to organize the harvest fête single-handed. Perhaps she is simply overtired." Her blue eyes, mild and piercing, settled on the organist with grandmotherly reproof. Wainwright bowed stiffly and stalked away. Jessica helped Miss Marple back to a wicker chair. "Is there some history between those two?" she asked quietly. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl. "History? Not quite, though I dare say there soon will be. Mr. Wainwright is a proud man, and the loss of his sister's brooch last month has put him quite on edge. He believes it's stolen." "By Mrs. Meredith? Or by someone close to her?" A faint smile curved the older woman's lips. "I observe, my dear. I do not accuse." Before Jessica could probe further, the sharp clap of the vicar's hands summoned the crowd for the raffle. Prizes ranged from a jar of Colonel Bantry's honey to a rather formidable gardening fork. As numbers were drawn, Jessica noticed Mrs. Meredith standing alone under the quince tree, eyes darting towards Wainwright, who steadfastly ignored her. Then young Tommy pushed past with a muttered apology, and something small slipped from his pocket, a silver fountain pen engraved with initials. Jessica recognized them at once. L.W. Tommy snatched it up, cheeks crimson, but not before Jessica saw Miss Marple's gaze narrow in quiet calculation. The raffle concluded, Reverend Clement produced a battered bugle to thank everyone for attending. A polite cheer rose. Yet beneath the applause, Jessica sensed a tremor, as though the village itself held its breath. She felt again the peculiar electricity that precedes trouble, an intuition honed in countless investigations. As the guests dispersed, a sudden gust rattled the yew hedge, and from the neighbouring churchyard came the dull clang of metal on stone. Colonel Bantry glanced over. "Caretaker locking up, I expect," he said, though his voice held uncertainty. Jessica's instinct pricked. "I think I'll just see if Miss Marple wishes to return home," she said lightly. But her mind was already sorting impressions: a shattered saucer, a missing brooch, a borrowed pen, and a private clang in a place of rest. In Cabot Cove, she had learned that the smallest sound could herald the darkest deed, and somewhere she felt sure St Mary Mead's tranquil surface was beginning to crack. Chapter 2. Whispers beneath the yew tree. Sunday morning dawned with gentle rain tapping against the window panes of Daymead Cottage. Jessica Fletcher, still in her robe, cradled a cup of strong tea and gazed out at the garden, where a blackbird pecked disconsolately at the wet lawn. St Mary Mead, soaked in grey, looked peaceful, too peaceful if she were honest with herself. A soft knock came at her door. When she opened it, she found Miss Marple's housemaid, Florence, damp and flustered. "Beg pardon, ma'am," the girl said, twisting her cap, "but Miss Marple sent me. She wondered if you might come over. She's had some unsettling news." Jessica nodded. "Of course. Let me fetch my coat." Moments later, umbrella in hand, she was hurrying across the narrow lane. The village was unusually quiet for a Sunday. No dog walkers, no bicycles. Only the toll of the church bell, solemn and low. Miss Marple greeted her from the drawing room, dressed immaculately in lavender wool despite her lingering illness. "Jessica," she said without preamble, "I'm afraid something dreadful has happened." She passed a copy of the Hampshire Gazette. Jessica scanned the headline. "Body found in St Mary's churchyard, foul play suspected." Her breath caught. "Who?" "Leonard Wainwright," Miss Marple said gently. "Found at first light by Mr Sims, the groundskeeper. Bludgeoned, they say, behind the yew tree near the south wall." Jessica sank into the armchair. "That's where the noise came from yesterday, during the raffle." Miss Marple gave a slow nod. "Yes, I thought it odd at the time. A clang against stone as though something had been dropped. Or thrown." Jessica's mind stirred. "He had an argument with Mrs Meredith during the tea. You mentioned the missing brooch." "She did seem agitated, didn't she? Though I imagine several people in the village had cause to dislike Leonard." Jessica considered. "You said he believed the brooch was stolen. Did he accuse anyone outright?" "No," Miss Marple replied, "but he made it quite clear at choir practice last week that certain persons new to the village had lowered the tone of St Mary Mead." Before Jessica could respond, the bell rang again, this time at Miss Marple's front door. Florence reappeared, this time with Reverend Clement, rain dripping from his hat and glasses. "I do apologize, ladies," he said, "but I thought you ought to know. The police are interviewing all who attended the garden party yesterday. Inspector Cray arrived from Much Benham just after breakfast." Jessica rose. "They'll want to speak to me, I imagine." "Indeed," the vicar said grimly. "And Mrs Meredith, poor woman's in quite a state. She's refused to speak to anyone except you, Miss Fletcher." Jessica and Miss Marple exchanged a glance. "Where is she?" Jessica asked. "In the church hall. I gave her a pot of tea, but I don't think she's touched it." Jessica followed the vicar into the rain-drenched morning. The walk was short, but the weight of the news hung heavy between them. The church hall was dim and cold, lit only by a few overhead bulbs. Mrs Meredith sat at a wooden table, hands wrapped tightly around a handkerchief. Her blonde hair was frayed at the edges, and her blue coat looked damp at the shoulders. Jessica approached softly. "Mrs Meredith, may I sit?" The woman nodded, barely lifting her eyes. "I know this is difficult," Jessica said kindly, "but you were seen arguing with Mr Wainwright yesterday. Do you want to tell me what it was about?" "I didn't kill him," she whispered. "I swear to you, I would never." Jessica waited. Mrs Meredith closed her eyes. "He threatened me, said if I didn't return what he'd lost, he'd go to the papers. That my husband, my late husband, had a scandal." Jessica leaned in slightly. "And did he?" "A banking matter. Years ago. We left London to escape it all. I came here for peace." Jessica nodded slowly. Did you take the brooch? No, but I think I know who did. Her fingers trembled. It was Tommy Clement. I saw him outside the vestry fiddling with the offering box, and he dropped something shiny when he saw me. A piece of jewellery. Jessica's mind flicked to the pen he dropped the day before. Why not tell someone? Because Leonard saw him too, and he was using it to blackmail me. Jessica sat back, her thoughts racing. Tommy Clement, young, clever, and perhaps just a little too smooth for his years. But motive and means? Before she could press further, the door opened again, and a tall man in a long coat entered, removing his trilby. His expression was calm, but firm. Mrs. Fletcher? Inspector Cray. I understand you've spoken to the deceased's acquaintance. Jessica rose to shake his hand. Only just. She's understandably shaken. We've got more than a few loose threads here, Cray said, with a slight northern burr. Found a gardening fork at the scene. Blunt force trauma, no prints. Jessica raised a brow. A gardening fork. Colonel Bantry donated one to the raffle, didn't he? He did, said Cray, but the prize is still wrapped in brown paper under the vicar's table. Jessica met his eyes. Then someone brought their own. The inspector nodded, and likely with purpose. As he stepped aside to continue questioning, Jessica walked back into the damp air of the village, the tolling bell now long faded. One death, one brooch, one boy with sticky fingers. But the truth, she suspected, was still buried, somewhere beneath a yew tree. Chapter 3. Secrets among the choir. The Monday following the murder arrived draped in damp fog and muted conversation. Jessica Fletcher wandered through the village high street, passing the bakery, where Mrs. Donnelly whispered urgently to a customer behind a clouded window, and the post office, where Mr. Ridgewell paused mid-stamp as she walked by. No one greeted her openly. St Mary Mead, for all its rose-covered cottages and well-trimmed hedges, had closed ranks. Jessica wasn't offended. She recognized the look, wary curiosity mixed with guarded fear. A man was dead, one of their own, and the outsider might well uncover things better left unearthed. She reached the church at mid-morning, where the Reverend Clement had granted permission to observe that day's choir rehearsal. The choir was short of voice, but practice carried on. The remaining singers gathered beneath the stained glass window of St Cecilia. Jessica sat discreetly in the last pew, her notebook on her lap. Though she wasn't writing, she was watching. Tommy Clement, the vicar's teenage son, stood in the bass section, half singing and half smirking, his eyes flitting often to the choir girl beside him, Ginny Arkwright. She, in turn, appeared less interested in notes than in the quick glances she exchanged with Mrs. Roper, the choirmaster's wife. Jessica caught it. A silent message passed through narrowed eyes. The choir concluded the hymn, and as Reverend Clement clapped gently, Jessica rose. I wonder if I might have a brief word with some of you? She asked politely. The group murmured uncertainly, but it was Mrs. Roper who stepped forward, her smile tight. Of course, Mrs. Fletcher, she said, though I dare say we don't know much that would be useful. Jessica smiled kindly. Often it's not what people know, but what they remember. Small things, shifts in mood, arguments. Mrs. Roper hesitated. Well, Leonard had been increasingly unpleasant these last few weeks, less patient with the altos, quite sharp with me about last Sunday's tempo. Her hands folded tightly in front of her. He seemed convinced someone had wronged him, mentioned justice in the vestry. Jessica tilted her head. Did he say who? No names, just muttered about keeping appearances and paying the price. Sounded more like theatre than threat, if I'm honest. Tommy, lingering nearby, spoke up. He was a prat. Excuse me, but he treated everyone like servants. Once accused Mr. Holloway of singing flat on purpose. Did he ever accuse you? Jessica asked lightly. The boy stiffened. No. But his eyes flicked downward. Jessica let it sit. Did you ever go near the vestry alone? She continued. He scoffed. What, sneak around the church? That's not me. Ginny Arkwright cleared her throat. He did, though. I saw him once. Thought he was nicking biscuits from the church kitchen. Tommy flushed crimson. They were for the youth club. Jessica watched them both, young, defensive, and dancing around something. Not the murder. But something. She smiled at Ginny. And you, dear? Did Mr. Wainwright ever speak to you directly? Ginny hesitated. Only once. He asked if I knew where his sister's brooch was, said I looked the sort who notices details. Jessica's brow lifted. That's rather an odd compliment. The girl shrugged. I didn't take it that way, just nodded and said no. As they spoke, Inspector Cray entered quietly through the side door. He caught Jessica's eye and beckoned her away. In the narthex, he folded his arms. "We've confirmed the time of death. Between 3:45 and 4:15 yesterday afternoon. That puts it squarely during the garden party." Jessica nodded. "He was alive when the raffle began. I saw him near the rose arbor just before that." "We also traced the gardening fork." Cray tapped his notepad. "It's from Miss Hartnell's shed. She keeps her tools marked with red tape." Jessica was surprised. "Miss Hartnell? The retired schoolmistress?" "The same. Says it went missing a week ago but thought nothing of it. Now she's worried someone borrowed it for darker purposes." Jessica's mind raced. That changes things. Whoever killed Leonard planned it ahead of time. Cray gave a half smile. "I see why you're famous." She ignored the compliment. "It also means the motive may not be about the brooch. It could be older, more personal." Cray nodded. "Speaking of personal, we found something else in Leonard's coat pocket." He produced a small evidence bag. Inside was a creased note, written in blue ink. "I know what you did. You'll regret it." Jessica took a breath. "That doesn't sound like idle gossip." "No signature," Cray said, "but we're testing the handwriting." Jessica narrowed her eyes. "Let me guess, everyone claims they never saw it before." "Bingo." She tapped a finger to her chin. "Then it's time I spoke to Miss Hartnell." Back outside, the air had cleared, but the sense of foreboding had not. As she passed the yew tree where Leonard Wainwright had fallen, she paused. A black feather lay in the grass, sleek and odd against the green. She picked it up, frowning. "Rook," she muttered, or magpie. Birds that like shiny things. And suddenly she remembered something. Wainwright's sister's brooch hadn't just gone missing. It had vanished after a commotion in the garden weeks ago, a rook swooping through the churchyard, sending teacups flying. Could it be that the brooch hadn't been stolen at all? Then why was Wainwright blackmailing Mrs. Meredith? The puzzle deepened, and Jessica knew the surface tension was ready to break. Chapter 4. The Red Tape and the Blackmail Ledger. Rain returned to St Mary Mead in fits and starts, turning gravel paths to slush and streaking windows with muddy lines. Jessica Fletcher stepped off the lane and up the front path to Primrose Cottage, home of Miss Beatrice Hartnell. The retired schoolmistress opened the door before Jessica could knock, her hawkish gaze already measuring her visitor. "Come in, Mrs. Fletcher," Miss Hartnell said, stepping aside. "Inspector Cray mentioned you might call. I gather my garden fork has become quite the object of interest." Inside, the drawing room was crammed with dark wood furniture, old-school trophies, and stiff floral cushions. Jessica took a seat on a carved chair and folded her hands. "Only because it was found near Leonard Wainwright's body," she replied. "I understand you noticed it missing last week." "I did," Miss Hartnell said crisply. "I was pruning the dahlias when I heard a crash in the shed. I assumed it was a branch falling. I didn't check until the following morning. By then, the fork was gone." Jessica tilted her head. "Did you report it?" "I did not," the older woman admitted, brushing imaginary crumbs from her lap. "One doesn't ring the police over a misplaced tool. Besides, I suspected Tommy Clement." Jessica's eyes narrowed. "Why him?" "He loiters, always near the sheds or behind the hall. Last month I caught him climbing over the hedge by the vicarage, red-faced and empty-handed." Jessica filed that away. Tommy again. Always near the edges of trouble, never quite in it. "Did you see Leonard Wainwright at the garden party?" Jessica asked. Miss Hartnell's lips thinned. "Of course," he made one of his usual barbed comments. Something about people who misplace what's not theirs to begin with. I ignored it. Jessica's brow furrowed. "You think the remark was aimed at you?" "It was aimed at everyone." Leonard excelled at vague insults, like a wasp pretending to be a bee. Jessica gave a faint chuckle. "Do you know anything about a note found in his coat pocket? It said, 'I know what you did. You'll regret it.'" Miss Hartnell didn't blink. "No, but it wouldn't surprise me if he wrote it to himself for attention. He thrived on drama." Jessica rose. "Thank you, you've been helpful." As she stepped out into the drizzle, she spotted a familiar figure under a black umbrella, Inspector Cray holding a folder thick with typed pages. He raised it. "You'll want to see this. Wainwright kept a ledger." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "A financial ledger?" Cray smirked. "Worse, a blackmail book. Names, notes, references to secrets. Mostly initials, but a few first names appear, including Helen M., London past, mustn't speak. Sound familiar?" Jessica frowned. "Mrs. Meredith. Her late husband was involved in a banking scandal. Leonard used it to manipulate her." Cray flipped a page. "He mentions Dahlia Shed. That lines up with what you just told me about Miss Hartnell." Jessica took the ledger and studied it. This isn't just idle observation. He catalogued misdeeds, like a schoolmaster keeping score. Cray glanced up. That ledger could have given someone motive to kill him, if he threatened to expose their secret. Jessica nodded. The fork was just a means. The motive was fear and control. Later that day, Jessica found herself back in the vicarage parlour, sipping tea with Reverend Clement. His eyes were weary. "You understand," he said slowly, "this is tearing the village apart. Leonard had enemies, yes, but he also had shadows." Jessica met his gaze. "Did you know about the blackmail?" "I suspected." He placed his cup down. He'd changed, more intrusive. He once asked me to open the offerings box while he stood over me. Jessica's pen paused. "Was it locked?" "Always. But a few weeks ago I found it unlatched. Nothing missing. But I began keeping closer watch." Jessica stood. "May I speak with Tommy again?" The Reverend hesitated. "He's in the garden shed." "Avoiding homework, no doubt." She found the boy behind the tool shed, fiddling with an old bike chain. He jumped at the sight of her. "I didn't do anything," he said before she could speak. Jessica held up her hand. "Tommy, no one's accusing you, but the truth always surfaces one way or another. Leonard Wainwright was using secrets to hurt people. I need to know, did he say anything to you?" Tommy hesitated. Then, quietly, "He told me I had a choice. Give him something valuable from the vicarage, or he'd tell the bishop my father was mismanaging funds. Said no one would believe a boy." Jessica's heart sank. "Did you give him anything?" "I tried. I took a pen from the vestry safe. It belonged to the bishop. But then I got scared and dropped it at the garden party. I didn't mean to. I was just trying to protect my dad." Jessica placed a hand gently on his arm. "I believe you." As she left the garden, Jessica's thoughts raced. Leonard had manipulated nearly everyone within reach, but someone had stopped him, for good, and she was beginning to suspect the killer wasn't young and impulsive, but old enough to know that secrets like weeds must be cut at the root. Chapter 5. A thread in the curtain. Tuesday brought clearer skies to St Mary Mead, but no clarity of conscience. Jessica Fletcher stood in the church nave, silent and still, her eyes lifted to the stained glass angels above the altar. The morning sunlight broke through their coloured wings, casting pools of red and gold across the flagstones. It was beautiful and eerily cold. Inspector Cray entered quietly from the south aisle, his notebook in hand. "They've ruled out random burglary," he said without preamble. "Nothing was taken from Wainwright's home, no forced entry. Everything left in precise order, including that cursed ledger." Jessica turned, which means the motive was personal and premeditated. Cray nodded. "We traced the note's paper. Parish stationery. Anyone could have taken it. No fingerprints. But we had handwriting analysis done on a sample from the ledger." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "It matches a letter found in Miss Hartnell's desk." Jessica paused, considering. So she might have written the threat. "She denies it," Cray said, slipping the notebook away. "Says she wrote a complaint to the bishop months ago and left it unsigned. Still doesn't explain why she'd lie." Jessica frowned. Unless she knew what Leonard had written about her. Enough to feel cornered. Enough to make a preemptive strike. The organ echoed faintly as the wind stirred through a cracked window. Jessica moved down the aisle, her shoes soft against the stone. "Did Leonard live alone?" she asked. Cray nodded. "His sister died years ago. Lived modestly. No pets, no known visitors. except for one curious detail. He flipped open a photograph and handed it to her. A bookshelf, 3rd row. Jessica narrowed her eyes. Between the hymnals and village records, a gap, a thick dust outline where a volume had been removed. "What was it?" she asked. "Dear," Cray replied. "The 1994 Parish ledger, last seen 3 weeks ago. The current one's still on the desk, but this older one, gone." Jessica felt a tug of intuition. "What happened in 1994? Cray shrugged. "Bit before my records. I've got someone checking diocesan archives." They walked through to the vestry, where Jessica paused beside the worn oak wardrobe that served as a coat cupboard. Her gaze swept the floor. She knelt suddenly, pulling aside a sagging mat. There, tucked into a crack in the floorboard, lay a small brass button. She picked it up. "Not Leonard's," she said. "His coat was wool. This looks like uniform brass." Cray peered closer. "Could belong to Colonel Bantry." Jessica straightened. "Or the late Mr. Meredith. He served too, didn't he?" "He did. Retired major, passed away last year." Jessica pocketed the button. Someone's trying to stitch together a version of the past. But not everything lines up. Later that day, she returned to Mead Cottage and found Miss Marple in the garden, with a blanket across her knees and a seed catalogue on her lap. "I've been thinking," Jessica began, sitting beside her, "about that missing 1994 ledger." Miss Marple gave a knowing hum. "The year Leonard returned from his sabbatical. There was some small scandal, you may recall. Nothing public, but I heard whispers." "What kind of scandal?" "Well," Miss Marple said delicately, "there was a suggestion that a certain organist had interfered in parish finances. Then he left, suddenly. Leonard stepped in as interim treasurer." Jessica blinked. "And he never gave up the role?" "Quite right. He kept the books until the day he died. Always meticulous, always secretive." Jessica looked across the garden. And if someone knew he'd kept record of that incident in the missing ledger— Miss Marple smiled faintly. "They'd have reason to retrieve, or destroy, it." Jessica rose, mind churning. "Thank you, Jane. I think it's time I paid a visit to the Bantrys." The Bantry estate stood stately behind iron gates and trimmed box hedges. Dolly Bantry welcomed Jessica in with warm chatter, but her husband, Colonel Arthur Bantry, looked less pleased. "I've already told the inspector everything I know," he grunted. Jessica sipped her tea. "It's not your knowledge I question, Colonel. It's the missing diary. You were treasurer before Leonard, weren't you?" Bantry's eyes narrowed. "Only for a year. I handed everything over properly." Jessica opened her handbag and placed the brass button on the tea tray. He froze. "Found in the vestry," she said mildly. "Very like your gardening coat, if I'm not mistaken." Bantry's jaw clenched. "I went to speak to Leonard privately the day before he died. He wasn't in. I must have dropped it then." "May I ask why?" He looked to his wife, then away. "He accused me of mishandling funds in 1994. Said he had written proof. Told me unless I paid, he'd go to the parish council." Jessica nodded slowly. "But you didn't kill him." Bantry's voice turned gravelly. "Good heavens, no. He was a menace, but murder? That's not my way." Jessica believed him, but someone else, someone quieter, cleverer, and with more to lose, had done just that. As she walked home under the golden light of late afternoon, she reflected on the growing list of suspects and secrets, each one more brittle than the last. And somewhere, hidden among choir notes, missing ledgers, and whispered blackmail, the truth waited, folded like a letter never sent. Chapter 6. Ginny's Confession. Twilight draped itself over St Mary Mead with a hush that even the sparrows respected. Jessica Fletcher sat alone on the bench in the churchyard, notebook balanced on her lap, her pen resting still. Gravestones cast long shadows in the slanting light, and the air held a certain pressure, like a storm building behind silent walls. She wasn't here to grieve, she was waiting. And right on time, Ginny Arkwright appeared, hesitating by the yew tree. The girl's school blouse was creased, her cardigan askew. When she spotted Jessica, she approached with small, reluctant steps. "I got your note," Ginny said, her voice low. "I'm glad," Jessica replied. "Sit with me." Ginny sank onto the far end of the bench, fiddling with her sleeves. "Is this about Tommy?" "In part." Jessica's tone was calm. "He says you saw him near the vestry when the bishop's pen went missing." Ginny hesitated, then shook her head. "No, I only said that so he'd stop bragging about youth club. He annoys me." Jessica observed her closely. "You also said Leonard asked if you'd seen the brooch." Ginny nodded. "He scared me. He said girls like me knew how to keep secrets, that I reminded him of someone. I didn't know what he meant." Jessica leaned forward. "And what secrets are you keeping, Ginny?" The girl was silent for a long time, then very softly, "I saw someone in the vestry, 2 days before Leonard died, late, after choir practice." Jessica's breath caught. "Who?" Ginny stared straight ahead. "Mrs. Roper." The name fell like a stone into still water. She had a bunch of keys. She opened Leonard's cupboard and pulled out this big leather book. "She didn't see me." Jessica's heart raced. "Did she take anything?" "I think she wrote in it." Ginny's voice trembled. Then she locked it again and left. Jessica scribbled notes quickly. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" "I thought maybe she worked for the church, or maybe Leonard had told her to do it, but then he was killed and I didn't know what to think." Jessica stood. "You did the right thing by telling me now." Before parting, she gently asked, "Have you seen the brooch?" Ginny shook her head. "No, but I remember a bird flying through the hall the day it vanished. A rook, I think." Everyone screamed, and Mrs. Roper dropped her handbag. I helped her pick things up. A memory clicked in Jessica's mind. The feather by the yew tree, the missing brooch, the leather ledger. She squeezed Ginny's hand. That night, Jessica walked to the Roper's cottage, just beyond the church gate. Mrs. Roper opened the door with a rehearsed smile that faltered the moment she saw Jessica's expression. "May I come in?"
Of course. The sitting room was spare and tidy, filled with lace doilies and piano music sheets. Mr. Roper wasn't home. Jessica sat without waiting to be asked. "You had access to Leonard's ledger." Mrs. Roper's smile vanished. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm saying you knew what Leonard had written about your husband, about the affair in 1994, the ledger he kept to ensure no one crossed him. You altered it, perhaps to protect your reputation, or his." The woman was still, frozen with her hands on the armchair. "You knew Leonard was preparing to expose several people at the next parish council meeting. You couldn't stop him with reason. So you found another way." Mrs. Roper lowered herself into the opposite chair. "I didn't kill him." Jessica didn't blink. "But you helped someone who might have." The silence that followed was like broken glass. "Leonard ruined lives," Mrs. Roper said finally. "He called himself righteous, but he enjoyed it. The fear, the power." Jessica nodded slowly. "You didn't bludgeon him, but you removed the real 1994 ledger. You replaced it with a falsified one." Mrs. Roper's eyes welled with tears. "He threatened to bring it up again, my husband's disgrace. Said the church deserved cleansing. I couldn't bear to see everything collapse again." Jessica stood. "Where's the original ledger?" Mrs. Roper opened a drawer and handed over a small wrapped parcel. Jessica unfolded it to reveal a brown leather-bound book. Dusty, untouched, real. "I found it in the vicarage cupboard weeks ago," Mrs. Roper said. "I thought I could stop all this." Jessica studied her. "But someone else couldn't." Mrs. Roper met her gaze. "I never said a word to Arthur Bantry, but I know he wasn't the only one Leonard was squeezing. There were others." Jessica left with the ledger under her arm and her thoughts racing. She walked through the twilight toward St Mead, where Miss Marple waited at the window like a beacon. Inside, with the lamp casting warm light over the armchairs, Jessica placed the ledger on the table. "I think we're nearly there," she said. "The killer knew about this book, and that rook flying through the church hall, I believe it took the brooch, not a person." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Just as well birds don't tell tales." Jessica nodded. "But people do, and I believe the final thread is ready to unravel." The storm had broken not with thunder, but with quiet, undeniable truth. Chapter 7. The Harvest Moon Revelations. The annual St Mary Mead harvest fête arrived as tradition dictated on a crisp Thursday beneath a soft orange sky. The churchyard had been transformed with hay bales, paper lanterns and trestle tables laden with pies, preserves and prize-winning marrows. Laughter bubbled from the children's games, but under it ran a different current, tense, watchful, waiting. Jessica Fletcher moved among the stalls with purpose. Her eyes scanned not the jams and nibware but the faces, those who avoided her gaze, those whose smiles rang hollow. Miss Marple, seated in a place of quiet advantage by the jam tent, gave her the smallest of nods. Jessica turned, stepping toward the flower-judging table, where Dolly Bantry was deep in debate over dahlia categories. Colonel Bantry lingered nearby, arms folded, but it was not him she approached. "Mrs. Roper," Jessica said gently, "a word, if you please." The choirmaster's wife froze mid-step, caught off guard. "Now? Here?" Jessica gave a small smile. "It's important." They moved behind the tea urns, shielded from view by a flapping Union Jack bunting. Jessica produced the original 1994 Parish ledger from her bag and set it gently on the tablecloth between them. "Does this look familiar?" Mrs. Roper's face went pale. Jessica didn't wait. "It wasn't you who altered the books. You told me as much. You only found them and decided to hide them." "I was protecting my husband," she whispered. "He was younger then, foolish. But Leonard had no mercy." "No," Jessica agreed, "he didn't. But someone else used that ledger for a different kind of protection, to silence Leonard permanently." Mrs. Roper looked away. Jessica lowered her voice. "And I think you know who." Before she could reply, a loud clang echoed from the far end of the churchyard, a metal ladder toppling. Cries of alarm rang out. Jessica and Mrs. Roper rushed to the source. Near the old stone boundary wall, a group had gathered. Tommy Clement stood red-faced and shaking beside an overturned table. At his feet, half buried in a garden basket of apples, glinted a familiar object, a silver and emerald brooch. Gasps rippled. Inspector Cray stepped in from the edge of the crowd. "Well," he muttered, crouching to retrieve it, "looks like the missing brooch has made an appearance." Jessica leaned closer. "And where did this basket come from?" Mrs. Donnelly, wide-eyed, spoke up. "That one? It's been in my cellar all year. I only brought it out for display this morning." Jessica's eyes lit. "May I see the cellar?" Down in the stone-walled storeroom beneath the shop, Jessica ran a finger along the wooden shelves. Dried herbs, crates of bottled cider, gardening tools from last season, and an empty hook, red paint chipped around the metal tip. Jessica pointed. "This is where the missing fork came from. Not Miss Hartnell's shed, Mrs. Donnelly's." Cray frowned. "That's not possible."
"Miss Hartnell's fork had red tape," Jessica interrupted. "Red paint, Inspector, not tape. Someone used it to frame her, moved the murder weapon after the fact." Back in the garden, Jessica gathered the key figures by the apple press, the Bantrys, the Clements, Ginny Arkwright, Mrs. Roper, and finally, Mrs. Meredith. "Everyone," Jessica said, her voice calm but cutting through the noise, "I think it's time we understood what really happened." She held up the brooch. "This went missing weeks ago, not stolen, but taken by a rook. That bird flew into the church hall, startled the guests, and snatched a shiny object from an open handbag. It later dropped it, likely into a basket in Mrs. Donnelly's cellar, where it remained hidden. Until today." She paced slowly. "Leonard Wainwright accused many of theft and impropriety, but his most powerful weapon wasn't truth. It was fear. His ledger held not just facts, but innuendo and speculation. That ledger gave someone motive to kill." Jessica turned to Mrs. Meredith. "You were being blackmailed, but you didn't kill him. You came to me because you were afraid." She turned to Colonel Bantry. "You were threatened too, but your temper burns fast and cools quickly." Her gaze fell on Tommy. "You took the bishop's pen, but to protect your father, not for greed." Then Jessica looked at Ginny. "You saw the real story. Thank you for being brave." Finally, she faced Mrs. Roper. But the one person who remained silent and calculated was standing at the edge of every rehearsal, watching. A pause. "No," she said suddenly, turning to the last person who hadn't yet spoken. "Mr. Roper," Jessica called. A tall, quiet man stepped from behind the cider tent, face pale, hands clenched. "You," she said softly, "had more to lose than anyone. Leonard knew about your past, how you forged a check in 1994, how you left your position in shame. He threatened to publish it in the parish newsletter, didn't he? Mr. Roper swallowed. He would have ruined everything. Jessica nodded. And so you waited until the garden party. You took the fork from Mrs. Donnelly's cellar. You had access through choir deliveries. You lured Leonard behind the yew tree under the pretense of reviewing choir arrangements. You struck him once, just once, because you knew you wouldn't get another chance. The crowd was dead silent. Mr. Roper looked to his wife. Her eyes glistened. I did it, he said softly. I didn't mean to, but I couldn't let him destroy us. Inspector Cray stepped forward slowly. Jessica, steady as ever, looked down at the silver brooch in her hand, a murder born, not of malice, but of desperation. And in the fading light of the harvest moon, justice quietly took its place.
Chapter 8. The Quiet Truth.
It was a week after the harvest fête, and a rare peace had returned to St Mary Mead. The church bells chimed gently across the village rooftops, and a low autumn mist clung to the hedgerows like the final sigh of summer. Jessica Fletcher stood by the vicarage garden, a wool shawl around her shoulders, watching dew gather on the tips of the rose petals. Inside, tea was being poured and cake politely refused. Miss Marple had invited just a few close neighbours for a subdued gathering, not for gossip but for healing. A village does not emerge from a murder untouched, even when the truth is known. Jessica lingered outside until the door creaked and the Reverend Clement joined her. I still can't quite believe it, he murmured. Mr. Roper, of all people. Jessica nodded solemnly. That's how fear works. Quiet men can do desperate things when they feel everything is at risk. The Reverend clasped his hands, and yet he confessed without resistance. He loved his wife, and his place here. Leonard threatened both. He didn't strike out of hate, but from the belief he had no other escape. The vicar sighed deeply. He'll serve his sentence, I imagine? Jessica nodded. The inspector thinks the court will show some mercy, considering his confession and circumstances, but he will pay a price. They walked together back toward the sitting room where a low fire glowed and conversation floated on cups of chamomile. Colonel Bantry stood by the mantel, speaking softly with Mrs. Meredith, who now seemed lighter, no longer shadowed by fear. Ginny Arkwright sat beside Florence the housemaid, giggling over a plate of biscuits. Tommy Clement was helping his father rearrange hymnals in a side cupboard, every so often looking toward Jessica with shy gratitude. As Miss Marple passed her a fresh cup of tea, Jessica sat beside her old friend. It's always the quiet ones, isn't it, she said, half to herself. Miss Marple gave a knowing smile. Not always. But quiet desperation can be a powerful thing. Still, you handled it beautifully, my dear, far better than Scotland Yard ever could. Jessica chuckled. I'm not sure Inspector Cray would agree. Oh, I think he would. He's already told Mrs. Donnelly that if you ever move to Hampshire, he's retiring early. Jessica laughed. The first real laugh in days. Well, I've no plans to relocate, though I must admit, there's something enduring about this place. Even in the face of murder, the roses bloom again. Miss Marple sipped her tea. That's the mark of a good village, and good people. As the clock chimed 5, Jessica stood and walked once more through the garden, past the last of the marigolds and the freshly swept path that wound toward the church. She stopped under the yew tree. The grass had grown back where Leonard Wainwright had fallen. There were no candles, no tributes, just silence and stillness, and perhaps that was best. He had stirred more fear than fondness in his final years, and the parish mourned more for the damage done than for the man himself. Jessica touched the trunk of the old tree. Secrets always come to light, she whispered, even in the shadows. A rustle of feathers above made her glance up. A rook, solemn and black-eyed, blinked down at her from the branch above. She smiled. Back at St Mead Cottage, she packed her overnight case. The taxi would come in the morning, and from there it was a short ride to London, then home to Cabot Cove. As she zipped the case closed, a folded letter slid from the inside pocket. She opened it, Miss Marple's handwriting. My dear Jessica, you must come again. The parish roof may be fixed, but I dare say something else will fall from the sky soon enough. Yours in mystery and in tea, Jane. Jessica smiled and placed the letter gently back inside. Outside, the lights of St Mary Mead began to twinkle on, one by one, as the village settled into evening. The harvest had passed, the truth had come, and once again, justice had worn the quiet face of a clever woman who noticed what others missed. Tools.